Welcome everyone to the last session of the first day of the UNIX Student Symposium 2021. I'm thrilled to welcome our panelists on stage or on screen, and I will just take a few seconds to introduce them to you. First, we welcome Megan Peters and Pim Haselager, who just gave an amazing keynote talks and have been introduced earlier. Additionally, we welcome on stage today Stefanie Blain-Moraes, who runs the Biosignal Interaction and Personhood Technology Lab at McGill University. She holds the Canada Research Chair in Consciousness and Personhood Technologies. Recently, she initiated the first Canadian Consciousness Research Symposium. As our fourth and last panelist today, we welcome Irina Rish. She is an associate professor at the Computer Science and Operations Research Department at Université de Montréal and a core faculty member of MILA Quebec AI Institute. She holds the Canada Research Chair in Autonomous AI. Her research focuses on machine learning, neural data analysis, and neuroscience-inspired AI. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Charlotte Maschke. I'm a PhD student at McGill, and I will be the moderator for this panel. Thank you all for being here. So before we start with the first question, I would just like to take the opportunity to encourage all attendees to contribute with their questions. Because Crowdcast has a limited number of speakers on screen, we can't bring you on screen, but we encourage you to write your question into the Q&A box. Additionally, we try to take advantage of the online platform as much as possible. So you as an audience will have the opportunity to actively contribute to the conversation by answering the polls that we will be posting during the discussion. Feel free to contribute. Okay, so to warm up and for the upcoming discussion and to get an overall idea about where our panelists and attendees stand, we will start with a yes/no question for the beginning. Please give a thumbs up or please vote with yes if you agree to this question. Can consciousness be fully described as a physical process? So for the attendees, there will be a poll, and you're really encouraged to just click yes, no, or not sure. And for the panelists, please give a thumbs up or thumbs down, and we will maybe wait a few seconds for the audience. Okay, so we have really diverse opportunity of, yeah, Pim just came back on video. Oh, it's a thumbs up. Okay, so it seems like we have really opinions all over the place. 30% of the attendees voted with yes, 23 with no, and 46 were not sure. Okay, so that's just a great question to get an image of who we're talking to. So then I think we can directly dive into the first question with like more discussion, which is, do we need to fully understand the emergence of consciousness in the human brain in order to implement or build consciousness in an artificial agent? So here, feel free to just express your opinion or even elaborate more on your opinion on the previous question. So maybe Irina, I know your research is quite focused on AI and the application of neuroscience and cognitive science. Do you think neuroscience might be faster or AI might be faster to build some consciousness without the understanding of neuroscience?
Well, that's definitely a very good controversial question for the panel. Excellent job, first of all. Second, yeah, as usual, just like with everything in AI, the concept that is not completely well defined is hard to judge whether it's achieved or not. And consciousness, I think, is one of those concepts. But in general, I think that it's not absolutely necessary to understand the exact biological process of whatever phenomena, including consciousness, in order to hypothetically recreate it in other kind of media, non-biological one. So in principle, the answer is maybe not, as long as you agree on key principles and definitions of what you, I would say, consciousness is. Like, how are you going to judge that the system has consciousness? Something like Turing test for that or something. So I think you can achieve that without absolutely, completely understanding how consciousness arises in human brain, because it may take some time to do so. Yeah. So I would say that the answer is potentially yes.
Okay, it seems like the audience also agrees more on yes, with 50% voting. Oh, but we still only have 2 votes, so maybe we'll wait a little.
I'll just add on to what Irina said. I think that so much of this depends on the ability to measure what we're talking about. And so being able to define an output, what does it mean to have something to be conscious, is how you define this will completely depend, it will determine the answer to this question. And we don't have a good definition of consciousness. What is consciousness in humans still? I mean, so in my research, we do a lot of work with individuals with traumatic brain injuries, individuals in coma, and we know that consciousness and responsiveness can be dissociated in these cases. Charlotte, just for full disclosure, Charlotte is my PhD student, and so Charlotte, you well know that even individuals with very, very broken appearing brains, eventually, in a few days, they recover the ability to respond. That moment that we measured them, were they conscious? We don't know, because we don't have the ability to quantify this in humans. And so I think that the ability to define what we're talking about, it will be key to deciding whether we can build consciousness in a non-human in the first place. I think that is the first challenge facing the field.
Yes, I totally agree with this. And I think for you, Megan, do you want to say something before we switch to the ethics of this question?
Sure. Yeah, I'll weigh in. I think to build on what Stefanie was just saying, I totally agree. We don't have a good way of measuring it and quantifying it yet. We don't even know what the right way to go about measuring it and quantifying it would be, let alone have the rightness, like the tool to do that. But I am personally in the camp that I think that whatever it is that generates or creates or facilitates consciousness is more likely to be a multiply realizable process than not. So I don't think that it is something that is impossible to instantiate outside of this particular biological system. And so I think that one of the ways that we should go about trying to answer that question is really the functional questions and the information-driven questions. Not to say that consciousness is information or that awareness is information, but that I think that limiting ourselves to the biological processes is probably not the right way to go. And so to that extent, I think that the different levels of inquiry, the different levels of study are what we should be focusing on for this question. That if we can fully describe a system at the computational level, at the information level, at the goals that the system is trying to solve, we don't necessarily need to get down into the wetware. So maybe we get a full explanation at Mars' highest level of analysis and not the lowest one, and that would be good enough for us to be able to build it into a machine. Maybe.
Yes, so it seems like there's quite some consensus about the aspect that before going into this direction, we would need to have a clear definition and a way to test whether or not a system is conscious. And I think this nicely relates to the next question, which focuses on philosophy and the role of philosophy in this part, because philosophy is working for centuries on this. So the question is, how can we efficiently collaborate with philosophers who have been studying consciousness for centuries? How can we integrate such theories in our work with a data-driven research? Can we maybe start with Tim, who is the philosopher in our panel?
Oh dear. Yeah, that's what you get for being a philosopher. Can I go just a little bit back to the first question? Because my own personal take, which of course is far removed from the very fascinating modeling and empirical work that Megan was showing. I thought I was really impressed. But why are we so sure that we will find consciousness in the brain? So I said very briefly in my talk that I very much believe in embodied embedded cognition. And so for me, consciousness is primarily a social phenomenon, for instance, that's the embeddedness. And maybe also precisely embodied in the sense that Megan perhaps doesn't agree with, because I understand you're more in the functional domain. But so, okay, I've never dared to write it, but I have this paper in my head that I would love to write with a title. I'm not sure I can mention it here. It's called The Shit Theory of Consciousness. And that would be my theory. And there is a point there that I think, for instance, metabolism, the sort of ingestion something from the outer world into the system and incorporating that and sustaining that to repair yourself or to sustain yourself, autopoiesis in Maturana and Varela's terminology, could be a crucial ingredient to make a first genuinely felt distinction between good and bad. And that's where the origin of meaning for me lies. You can already tell I'm a philosopher, right? I go off into very general statements, but what can I do? So I think all this work on informational theories, and that includes, again, the very great work on metacognition, is information about information, and we don't get out of that loop. So maybe it's time to start with something simpler, but something more biological. That would be my take on consciousness in general. No idea if that makes sense. I haven't written the paper yet. I don't dare to with a title like that. You know how you're going to get it published. But yeah, one of these days, shortly before I go with pension, I will write that one. Yeah.
To me, it connects somewhat to Antonio Damasio's ideas, right?
Yes,
about
totally.
Embodied cognition and about feelings being essentially absolutely necessary for intelligence as kind of ways of gathering information from the body, and impossibility of consciousness without the body, and connection of the body with the environment. So
exactly.
Homeostasis-driven intelligence kind of type of ideas, I think that connects really well indeed.
Yeah, and I think it also, of course, you need the brain for, it plays a crucial part in especially human consciousness. But I think also for animals, it always strikes me as fascinating that very simple creatures can already, at least to me, appear to have a kind of awareness. Like, for instance, you can see in stress studies that it's not about the intelligence. It's not about the complexity of the brain processes, I would think primarily, although, of course, they play a crucial role maybe in higher levels. So we're missing something very basic, which also means that I don't believe that with AI, we're currently on the right road to create something like awareness or consciousness or sentience.
And it's quite possible that you're indeed right. And that's why it was quite interesting to hear some plenary talks a few years ago at New Rips, the top machine learning conference, for example, by Michael Levine, on what bodies think about. As it was fascinating talk, and the whole line of research about kind of this awareness and memory emerging in communication systems, cellular systems, way before the first neuron appeared. So that's some primitive form of, intelligence. So
and just to mention something else, like the gut brain is, of course, a very fascinating area of study for consciousness, I would think. On my theory, metabolism to support homeostasis could be a very crucial first step towards something that we could call consciousness, and maybe we should go there instead of in the central nervous system. But yeah, it's...
I quite agree. It's an interesting idea, indeed, totally underexplored in AI. And many people agree with me, I know.
I think I will take this opportunity to redirect the panel discussion to another question, which directly relates to, because you have talked about, you were talking about consciousness and the body and consciousness in humans especially. And this nicely relates to the next question, actually, which is, which is more focused on human consciousness and the possibility of other forms of consciousness. So how would you describe the relation between consciousness and the self? Would you consider them as equivalent, or can one exist without the other? And here I think I would especially ask Stefanie and Megan about their opinion on this, because Stefanie is working with personhood, and I think this quite nicely relates to your research.
Thanks, Charlotte. I mean, I think I'll kill two birds with one stone. I'll answer this question and the question about how to embed philosophers into consciousness research together. So I spent a lot of time working with individuals who were born with severe and multiple disabilities. For the most part, for their entire life, were unable to move and unable to speak. And for many of them, most of them, the question of consciousness remained. But there were two different categories of these individuals. One of them, the parents, were mostly children. The parents would come in every day, buy them little presents. They walked by something on the road, found a bracelet, gave it to them. You know, there was this sense that of the individual's personhood. And then there were the individuals who, for one reason or another, were mostly abandoned and were a body in the bed who needed custodial care. And while the question of consciousness was the same across all of them, because behaviorally all of them looked had about the similar responses, the question of their personhood was very different based on how someone was treating them. And so to the point of where consciousness is, I think that I wrote a paper about how consciousness and personhood can be doubly dissociated, how you can have personhood without consciousness. And in some unique cases, consciousness without personhood, if you see practices in the operating room as people are emerging from anesthesia, for example, there's a moment where there's still an object, even though they're back, there's still an object. So they can be doubly dissociated. And I think that these examples give us, I don't have a good answer for you, Charlotte, but I think that these examples give us something to pull at when we talk about consciousness and the self. I think I would reframe the question a little bit more and talk about consciousness and interaction, consciousness and social behavior, rather than consciousness and the individual, because I think that there's something very poignant within the way that people interact with each other in order to develop and realize and acknowledge the status of another individual, the status of another person being conscious. To this end, I'm just going to circle back to the question that you had posed before about ingraining philosophers into the discussion. I have an enormous respect for philosophers. We actually have a visiting philosopher in the lab right now to engage with us on sort of a more theoretical level about the empirical work that we're doing. But I had started with this idea about consciousness and personhood, and knew that I'm an engineer by training. I didn't have the background, the theory background to really explore it. And so I brought it to a philosophy conference. And I found that, we as neuroscientists, we as engineers need to come to the philosophers and explain our jargon and make it very clear what everything within our neural networks and our functional connectivity things, we need to be able to present that in an accessible way. But in turn, philosophers needs to be able to come and meet us halfway. There are a group of philosophers I bumped into who are very interested in talking about Mary in a black and white room who is conscious only of black and white, and then eventually all of a sudden for the first time sees red, and these thought experiments that don't really meet us in the middle. And I think that there's work to be done on both sides, both from the neuroscientist and from the philosopher side, to find the common ground so that we can talk about these topics that need both sides to have input, full input.
Yeah. Can I just jump in for very brief, because I
Sure.
couldn't agree more. This is so important. And so I've been a philosopher that's been working at an empirical research institute all my life. So I'm the only philosopher in the building. There's only AI people and neuroscientists, basically, and psychologists. And what I learned from doing that is that it's so crucial to be able to explain as a philosopher how my conceptual analysis could be important or meaningful to the design of new experiments, the reinterpretation of the data, the reformulation of conclusions. If I cannot do that, I don't build the bridge. And unfortunately, in philosophy, we had in the 20th century a kind of tradition, the conceptual turn, where we said, okay, no, the concepts are for philosophers because the empirical researchers took basically everything else. And we wanted to sort of delimit our, and that did so much damage to the integration between philosophy and empirical science that I think that that's one of the biggest blunders in philosophy for the 20th century. On the contrary, philosophers have to be not in their own building, somewhere else on campus. They have to be in the labs and to work and talk daily with people, not only to understand and respect a little bit better, you know, how complicated good experiments or model building is, but also to be able to relate how conceptual analysis can be meaningful to empirical work. And also to understand that if we cannot explain that, then we're not so relevant. So I very much agree with your position here, yeah.
Can I add to that? Which is to say, again, I also agree. So we're all on the same page there. But to add further, I think one of the potential consequences of getting this right between philosophy and science is that the level of training to poke holes in stuff that philosophers receive is just unparalleled. And I think that taking a philosophy of science class should be required for anybody who wants to call themselves a scientist, first of all, to understand how our current scientific paradigms can twist and morph what we think is objective observation into something that we kind of are shoving into our little theory box. So I think that's really important, and I think it's something that philosophers can really help us scientists see where we are weak and see where our theories are circular and where we've left logical gaps and holes and are making unsupported and unjustifiable leaps in our understanding or in our conclusions. And I think that that's one way that they can really contribute. And in particular, speaking a lot with philosophers has been really helpful to my own work. And to the work that I hang out with a lot of scientists and engineers, and I also hang out with a lot of philosophers, and they push me to think like, okay, going back to the second question that was just asked, which is about the role of the self and the role of the self in consciousness. And I think that we need to be careful to differentiate between wakefulness versus coma and self-awareness versus phenomenal awareness, and whether the self is just a content that is inside our phenomenal awareness, or whether the self-awareness is it's a different kind of natural kind, if you will. So I think these are the kinds of ways that we can answer the question about the role of the self in consciousness. I personally think that there may be something special about reflective self-awareness that is not just phenomenal awareness of first order information. But I also think that you don't need to have awareness of self in order to be phenomenally aware. I think that there is absolutely something that it's like to be a rat or to be that creature behind me. I mean, there's something that it's like to be her. She doesn't know that she exists, but she still experiences pain and fear and pleasure and brightness and loudness and so on. And I think that there is something that is like. So I don't think you need to have awareness of the self there. But these distinctions, I think, are really important and allow us to try to take the conceptual questions and split them at their logical seams with the help of the philosophical community, and then build quantitative ways of asking those questions. So we can say, is awareness of self something different, or is it just awareness that has the content that is the self? And then I can say, oh, well, maybe this requires that I build a quantitative assessment of what the qualitative space looks like. And then I can go and push on that dimension and see if I can break that. And that kind of collaboration, I think, is going to be tremendous.
Yes, thank you so much. I also just got reminded that there was a question left after your keynote talk from Karim Gerbi. And I think it is okay for the panel if I just interrupt the panel discussion for a second to give the audience the opportunity to get an answer to this question, because we unfortunately didn't have the time earlier. So the question for your keynote talk was, are there reasons to believe that other forms of metacognition other than perceptual might provide complementary insight into the study of consciousness?
Yes. So I think the most obvious kind of other form of metacognition might be meta-memory or meta-learning, these kinds of things. But metacognition is a really broad term that, it's information processing or decision-making about something that is internal instead of about something that is external. So to the extent that we want to define meta-perception as monitoring of the internal representation of something that is out there in the world, we could redefine that pointer to just point at a memory or point at an emotion or point at a learning experience. And so I think, yeah, absolutely, that a complete science of metacognition, especially in service of trying to understand consciousness and phenomenology, if we want to go there, need by necessity include these other forms of metacognition. And that then building like this idea of what it is like to feel sure, maybe that's something that can cross these modalities. We know it can cross vision and audition, for example. And we know it's slightly different between perception and memory, but to the extent that they can be linked or there's a bridge in the computations or other things like that, yeah, absolutely, we need to include those. It's a great question.
If there are other panelists who want to answer to this question, I don't want to exclude you if you have strong opinion on this. Okay, otherwise, I would be interested, Irina, in your opinion on the interdisciplinary cooperation with philosophers in the field, on your experience with interdisciplinarity, or also on the question about the self, whether building a conscious system or a self-conscious system would be the same approach, or whether the systems that we have right now have more tendency to be conscious or have more tendency to have some kind of self-perception.
By systems we have now, you mean existing AI systems?
Yes.
Yeah, so
I'm just referring to some kind of image of the self as whether or not this might be, closer than the actual consciousness.
Well, I think it might be, well, in some sense, again, maybe it's not exactly answering this question, but just bringing, again, associations with what Antonio Damasio was talking about. In a sense, if maybe you use somewhat different approach to developing artificial systems, that instead of kind of trying to achieve some goal of performance, optimize some accuracy on some task, the usual thing that we do, if instead of that, you rather have those agents that just try to be there, just to stay alive, maintain homeostasis, and they can be hurt and they can die. So again, the idea is that perhaps intelligent behavior will emerge in order to kind of maintain this homeostasis and just to be. And maybe this kind of approach, as alternative to the usual kind of optimization-based, kind of reward-driven optimization of the behavior and tuning parameters. I mean, it's also probably involves some tuning parameters, but for the different reason and in different ways. So I kind of find it intriguing and potentially quite interesting and alternative. And regarding your notion of self, actually, I thought about that again when reading papers by Michael Levine, because he's really on the intersection of biology and philosophy, not exactly AI, but these ideas about kind of hierarchy of selves. And in a sense, I think it was like really, really interesting type of insight from cellular level to the organs and to the, well, animals and humans to societies and so on. So in a sense, you can say that there is a hierarchy of selves. And at each level, that self indeed trying to survive, to optimize some function. The problem occurs, well, again, in that case, when that happens only at the local level. So basically, it's the same function to maintain, to survive, to maintain homeostasis, but when the component of the whole actually keeps the scale, temporal and spatial, of that whole when trying to kind of adapt, that is usually better for that component and for the population as whole. I might not be explaining it well, and he has written much better, but it immediately made me think about how you might possibly implement it. It's the same objective function. What changes is temporal and spatial scale. And he was even giving an example of a cell forgetting that it's part of the organism and trying to optimize its survival and becoming cancerous, while changing interactions of the cell with the cellular network by chemical perturbations could actually revert the cancerous cell back to normal, which to me was mind-boggling. So anyway, so by analogy with this, I just saw that perhaps the way we develop artificial systems might be kind of redesigned and thought differently, on different principles. But yeah, I apologize for kind of really thinking aloud and giving you a brain dump, but I just think that this intersection is very important to explore. And it's not just neuroscience, but biology, AI, and philosophy. Perhaps philosophers need to give lectures in computer science departments, and AI majors will have to take philosophy classes.
Yes, we are back at philosophy. So,
but I'm a bit surprised that you don't have that, because we in our program I give neurophilosophy, for instance, for the Donder students, the master, and it's obligatory for all the students. I'm not saying we're necessarily happy with that, but there's no escape, let's say. And in the AI department, I also give classes that are obligatory for everyone on the philosophy for AI. So in the Netherlands, it seems to be kind of standard, but that's not the case.
Not at this point. We should do it, definitely. Yeah, no, I
might be an idea. Yeah.
I think people who are trying to build artificial intelligence should be at least somewhat familiar with other fields that studied intelligence from different perspectives, whether biologically or philosophically. Well, not even.
It's important.
Yeah.
It's important to have the right philosophers, in the sense that they don't start with Aristotle and then go to Kant and do the history of philosophy again, because that happens too. So again, you need the kind of philosophers that want to build a bridge with empirical sciences and that know a little bit about the empirical sciences. Otherwise, you could be just cross-passing,
right,
cross-talking and wasting your time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there should be. Well, it could be also a result of ideally collaboration between people from two fields, so you kind of arrive at the most relevant intersection questions. I mean, yeah, and then because you don't want really remote aspects of philosophy if you mainly focused on how mind works. Neuroscientists study how the brain works, and philosophy and other fields, including neuroscience and AI, study actually how the mind works, which not necessarily has to be implemented in brain. Yeah, so.
Yes, that's really insightful. And I think that's also touched on what Stefanie just explained earlier. Okay, so we still have 10 minutes left. And I would really love to ask one question which was really popular from the audience. Or, yeah, just one question. So if you could have any experimental equipment without any technical, financial, or ethical constraints, what experiment would you like to design to measure or to detect consciousness? And I think this is also, so this is for all the panelists. So even it's not required that it's a data-driven approach. So even for Tim, what do you think might be the most important thing to consider for such an experiment? And I know it's a really hard and controversial question. So
it's like experimental philosophy. Yeah? So this is just doing very simple things to test whether the conceptual distinctions that you make actually make an empirical difference. That's, for me, that is experimental philosophy, and they're very shoddy kind of experiments, of course, compared to what the experts do, but that's what I like. So I would like then, and it's really unethical, so we don't do it, to start with a system that would not be capable of having this metabolic interaction, homeostasis oriented with an environment, but would be capable of basic information processing about, let's say, the environment. A little bit like the robots are now. There's no meaningful metabolism in robots. You know, they get it in the pure form, no way else. Then gradually start changing the sort of metabolic interaction. So replacing the batteries with something that is actually a kind of comparable to an ingestion metabolic kind of process. And in a vague way, it reminds me of Mary the neuroscientist, the thought experiment, where you have this really quick switch, but here you would do it in steps, and you would in every time test whether certain, let's say, experiential distinctions, and whether that would be metacognition or not, we could, you can think about that, whether that started building up. But the problem is maybe that if you start too late, you've already lost it and you'll never get it back. So it has to be at a very early stage too. So there are some tricky things here that need consideration. But you can tell I'm a philosopher and not an experimentalist.
If ethics didn't come into play whatsoever, we could completely disregard this. I would systematically do what we do in the ICU. So we study broken brains in the ICU right now, and we have a sense of whether these individuals recover consciousness, whether they don't recover consciousness, whether we have a chance to maybe retrospectively look and whether they were able to have some sort of subjective experience while they were not responsive. But the injuries that come to us are completely dependent on whether someone was in a motor vehicle accident, or it's completely random at this point. And we are able to piece together from the different areas that the network is broken, different areas that the wiring is broken, the connectivity is broken, basic, very happenstance conclusions based on where the injuries happen to be. If we could systematically do this, take them with someone we know was conscious and systematically break the different connections to see what was making the consciousness, like someone conscious or not, at the point when they're able to continue to respond or not, I think this would be much more efficient, at least in our science, than just taking whatever injuries come into the ICU. Again, we would never do this. But if we're just in the thought experiment realm of being able to just play with ideas, I think that this would be very helpful for our study of consciousness.
Yes, thank you. So in the question, we really say without any ethical constraints. So it is really more some kind of a thought experiment. Yes, sure.
Can I add to that? I actually want to have a different take here, because there was a really interesting conversation about, almost 2 years ago now at CCN 2019, back in the before times when we were allowed to meet in person. And it was all about this debate of, is the bottleneck in understanding the mind, not just consciousness, but the mind, is it data or is it theory? And I am solidly on the theory side. I think that if we could go in and build a brain from the ground up, neuron by neuron, synapse by synapse, if we could record all the neural activity, if we could selectively turn things off and on again, I think that would be a great way of us building maybe causal explanations, but they wouldn't be satisfying, I don't think, yet. I think we still would be missing the link of how, especially for consciousness. It would be like, if I flip this switch, then suddenly ignition happens. And then the person wakes up. Hooray. Why? And I don't think that we would get there yet. And I think that this is very evident from all of the giant data sets that we're now building. I mean, the Allen Brain Institute is mapping the entire songbird connectome. And even when you go down into aplesia, you can actually measure the whole connectome, and we still don't know why the aplesia behaves the way it does. And it's an aplesia. And so I think that as much as that would, I think what that would tell us if we could go in and do these super unethical experiments where we go and like turn stuff off and turn it back on again, it might take us a step closer to understanding what types of theories we need to build. I don't think it would, in and of itself, build a satisfying explanation that we would feel like, okay, cool, we're done, like close that chapter. I think we've got a long way to go, and we really, our theories are just so impoverished right now that we just don't even know what we don't know yet.
Okay, thank you. Irina, do you maybe also have a dream experiment from an AI perspective? So
I just kind of had a comment when I was listening to previous answer that it feels like maybe even mapping everything neuron by neuron would not be enough, because what's going on depends not only on the structure, right, but on the processes that are constantly going on. So there is so much that is not really measured in a sense, right? So basically chemicals can alter your consciousness states and so on. You can try some drugs and it's totally different, for example, hypothetically, since you said that it doesn't have to be ethical experiment. Just kidding. But what I'm trying to say is, besides the structure, even everything is mapped, what really makes a difference maybe like the rest, like what chemical processes are going on there, right? And that's probably much harder to characterize. And it still also might not be enough because, so there are various ideas about other types of processes, not just chemical, but even on quantum level, who knows? But you don't know to what extent you really need to measure what is going on besides just having a static structure, even if you manage to map it. So I'm kind of, I'm not an experimentalist and not really a neuroscientist, but it would be interesting to figure out how to measure all that dynamics and see, because essentially even with exactly same brain, right, exactly same connectivity, simply, I don't know, changing the dynamics and kind of frequencies of oscillations by deep brain stimulation, for example, can completely, like, drastically change the behavior. I still remember those experiments about Parkinsonian patients where, I mean, essentially turn on the stimulation and their symptoms disappear, you turn it off, they appear again. And interesting work by Peter Tass a long time ago, where he instead was affecting those brains, trying to somehow desynchronize. I don't remember exactly the details, but in some sense, desynchronize some kind of bad, wrong kind of synchronization there over matters of months or two. And the symptoms indeed practically disappeared without any deep brain stimulation. So this kind of results of change in dynamics, this is mind-boggling. It didn't really seem to change the structure. It changes dynamics. And to me, I don't know, I mean, measuring that somehow and just trying to describe that brain dynamics and what aspects of that correlate to, say, consciousness or different behavioral things, that's I think is, that's kind of mind-boggling and would be interesting to do.
Yes, I totally agree on this. Oh, Megan, you have one more point.
I just wanted to follow on that. I think that I think you're spot on, Irina. And I think one way that artificial intelligence and neuroscience needs to do better at teaming up is by using explainable AI to understand the brain. So that we don't need to ourselves be able to understand it. We just need to build a system that can understand it and then explain it to us. And so maybe that's one way that that we don't need an explainable AI system to explain to us how it is solving a problem. Maybe we do. We want them to explain how they're solving a problem that they're solving. Like, this is how I learned how to tell cats and from hot dogs or something. But also building these tools to help dig around in the brain and dig around in the mind and then explain to us what's going on. I think that's a really fruitful way forward. That AI is not my area of expertise, but I feel like that there's a great amount of ground that could be covered there that would start to get at some of these issues.
Okay, sorry, I think I need to interrupt you because we are already at the end of our panel discussion. But I thank everyone for their contribution. And I also would like to point the audience to the chat. For those who haven't seen it yet, there are some really helpful resources posted by Megan and many other people. So if you're interested in these questions and to read further about some possible answers or some approach, then feel free to look at the chat, use these resources. And a part of this, thank you everyone for your participation and for this really interesting and encouraging, engaging discussion. So we are now transitioning quickly to some closing remarks and some really important announcements for tomorrow. So please stay online again a few more minutes. And thank you to all our panelists. It was really a really great session.
Thank you.